When I look at the modern 2020s video game landscape, I can't help but get a feeling of being overwhelmed. A wave of awe washes over me, calling attention to how massive and intricate video games have become. The games that win awards every year and grab the people's attention turn out to be these multi-hour epics that take place in beautifully crafted worlds from both imaginative fiction and our own history. You have games that detail the complicated nature of humanity, our decisions, and our emotions. There are also these games with so much technological functionality, with countless hours of mathematics to register all of the things happening on the screen at the same time. Development time for these kinds of games have skyrocketed astronomically. Video games came out annually during the early years of at-home console play, as it used to take an office full of people only a year to produce a sequel with already existing source material. Ask the creators of Doom Eternal or God of War Ragnarok if it would be even slightly within the realm of possibility to make the games that they did within a year, and they'll immediately laugh in your face. Then probably start breaking down in tears as you remind them of the amount of crunch they had to go through to get their games done in a decent amount of time in the first place. And I should make it clear, not every game that's come out in the last 4 or 5 years are these hyper-detailed open-world experiences. There are plenty of video games that exist in our modern library that contain smaller narratives with stylized graphics and innovative game design. Games like Hades, It Takes Two, and Tunic are all excellent video games in their own right and aren't nearly on the same massive scale of adventures like Elden Ring or The Last of Us Part 2. Despite the differences in scale, video games like these still take a lot of time to develop, and you can feel that passion and creativity in every pixel of the final product. Everything still feels intricate here. Even the simplest of puzzles or obstacles makes you feel like you've begun a huge undertaking. When a video game has convinced you that you're a part of that world, that you're actually in your character's shoes, that developer has done something right. But all of this immersion and all of these intricacies is given to us through incredible amounts of effort. It's just as easy for someone to be immersed as it is for someone to just walk past an object in the environment without giving it a second glance. For me personally, I feel a growing disconnect between the appreciation for the work that goes into developing a video game and the vision of the person who will end up playing that game. With the amount of all the expansive open world video games in the market growing on a yearly basis, it's easy to be engulfed in those design tactics. It's easy to be nostalgic for the way things used to be. The 6th generation of video games is often hailed as the golden age for video gaming, purely for its enormous library of games and the availability of consoles for the time. The Sega Dreamcast, Nintendo GameCube, Microsoft Xbox, and Sony PlayStation 2 each had several models of their own consoles and many marketing schemes to get folks to purchase their systems. With such a diverse number of consoles competing with each other, exclusivity was also factored into the equation as well, forcing video game developers to grow their teams and innovate their capabilities. The most successful developers in this era were the ones that could design a product that appealed to as many people as possible and also made it easy to pick up and play. Think Jak and Daxter, Super Mario Sunshine, Blinx the Time Sweeper, etc. If you had an identifiable mascot, a catchy theme song, and a decent budget, you had a star in your hands. Even the infamous Core Design, the creators of the Tomb Raider franchise, would jump into the waters of next-generation potential. After releasing a few spin-off titles featuring Lara Croft for the Game Boy Advance, Core Design would attempt to broaden their horizons and look for new avenues when producing their video games. This resulted in a handful of games outside of Tomb Raider, including Project Eden, a gory shooter with notoriously difficult puzzles, Thunderhawk, a combat flight simulator and the third game in a franchise dating back to the early 90s, and a little known title and the topic of today's video, a hidden gem known as Herdy Gerdy. Before Core Design destroyed their reputation in 2003 with Angel of Darkness, the staff there was attempting to lean into their earlier platforming roots, finding a happy medium between interactivity and artistic style, something tonally separate from Lara Croft and everything else from her world. During this time, a lot of ideas were thrown at the wall in an effort to get the green light for a brand new franchise. What came out of their efforts is something wholly unique, entertaining, and teeth-grinding all at the same time. On February 22nd, 2002, gamers were introduced to the playful, simplistic world that is Herdy Gerdy, an adventure platforming game where the player has to corral fantastic animals of various design into the correct pens as they journey to save the world from a grisly fate. Now, the phrase Herdy Gerdy is a double entendre. On the one hand, it references a string instrument, this huge, clunky thing that combines the effect of a guitar, an organ, and a keyboard. On the other hand, it directly references the main character the player takes control of, Gerdy, and how the objective of this entire game is to learn the methods and quirks to herding the various creatures of the land. Unlike other games in Core Design's lineup, Herdy Gerdy refuses to partake in over-the-top action and bombastic set pieces, and instead relies on the simplicity of predators, prey, and nature itself. Only by acquiring the various tools, solving intricate puzzles, and journeying through the entire continent will players begin to understand the rhythm that Herdy Gerdy is attempting to sing to you. This game doesn't have much going for it in terms of a storyline, but is somehow simultaneously steeped in its own lore that dates back thousands of years to the instance of creation itself. Players are introduced to Gerdy, who wakes up alarmingly when he recognizes that he and his father are late for a tournament of some kind. When he can't wake his father from his slumber, he enters a nearby village to seek help. Eventually, he meets an elder entity of the island, Yggdrasil, who explains that his father's rival in the herding tournament, an alligator named Seydorf, has placed a spell on him to keep him asleep eternally so that he doesn't have to risk a magical artifact in the tournament. Gerdy is given the mission to take his father's place in the tournament and must travel across the island to get there while he learns how to herd the various creatures that take residence there. As he proceeds, Gerdy will acquire valuable equipment and make fast friends with many who will help him, and eventually arrive at Tournament Island, where the competition is being held. Using his new skills and items, Gerdy defeats Seydorf's established records and wins the magical acorn from him, breaking the spell placed on his father, as well as returning harmony to the denizens of the island. Gerdy then retreats back to the forests of his home and is given a celebration by the townsfolk and the friends he made along the way, where his father and Yggdrasil praise him on his accomplishments. Where this game truly shines is in the simplistic, yet functional and consistent gameplay throughout the experience. The player is given a very basic set of controls from the start, and is never given anything that fundamentally alters how the game is to be played going forward. At the beginning, Gerdy is only capable of running and jumping, and the game shows us that this game will only ever ask you to do that the entire time. There's no hanging from ledges, climbing sheer cliffs, no crouching, no fighting. All the player has to worry about is putting these animals in pens. Eventually, the player is given additional items that alter this base ever so slightly to give them more options during gameplay. Items such as these boots, which give Gerdy infinite stamina to let him sprint forever, or this magical feather that makes him so light he can climb ladders made of sticks, or this vest that gives Gerdy the ability to swim in any water he comes across as easily as a fish. In addition to functional clothing, the player will also acquire instruments that manipulate the herding creatures in certain ways as well. This flute allows you to mesmerize certain creatures, making them follow the player for as long as they play it. This horn is so loud and obnoxious that it startles creatures away immediately while also attracting certain kinds of others. This stick, while pretty inconspicuous at first, is actually a musical instrument that emits a harmonious tune that gathers certain creatures around it for easy group management. Despite how essential these things are to progressing through the game, they work simply as tools, and are only as useful as the player allows them to be when stacking on top of the other movement mechanics. The creatures in this world that you'll be herding are also as unique as the items you'll be using throughout the game. Each one is affected by Gerdy in different ways, with different likes, dislikes, and behaviors in the wild. These little pink goofballs are called dupes, and are basically like the chickens of this world. Just running at them gives them a good spook, and they'll immediately group up as they flee in whatever direction you're running towards. Throwing this stick into the ground calms them and gets them to huddle around it, getting them out of the way of bigger creatures and keeping them occupied while you herd others. These purple cat-like buggers are called bleeps, and couldn't care less what you want to do with them. They'll hang out making a racket, jumping off of cliffs and roofs all day, ignorant to what's going on around them. Unless you're playing the flute, which hooks them with its melodies and gets them to follow you single file, you aren't getting them in their pens no matter how hard you try. There are others for you to herd, like these honks that can hatch honklings from their eggs and swim in any body of water, or these ants that will only follow you if you have a drummer of the correct color following you. There are also antagonistic creatures that you have to face down if you wish to herd them as well, such as these large pink yeti-like creatures named gromps. They'll chase Gerdy relentlessly until they either run over one of these pen traps or corner you and strike you so hard that it sends you flying somewhere halfway across the level. In my humble opinion, this game has some of the most underrated content ever to grace the presence of a PS2 disc. The art style is phenomenal. There's lots of inspiration from fantasy medieval settlements in the architecture and flora design. The villages of the forest are all made from sticks and logs with thatched roofing. Nothing more advanced than a mule-drawn wagon and a water wheel-powered mill are man-made in this world. The desert town of Midmere have these imposing stone structures built out of massive stones and bricks, resembling something like ancient Egyptian pyramids and temples. When you dive into the mythical forests here, you'll come across contraptions using whimsical pulley systems. Paths through the lands go from cobblestone to beaten dirt and are covered up by underbrush and other foliage. The denizens of this land aren't your stereotypical fantasy folk either. There is, of course, a human settlement in the very beginning, containing all kinds of people. The ancient grandma of the village rests on her rocking chair, squinting to see even a few inches in front of her before pulling out these glasses that have massive lenses to recognize you. The miller's daughter happily hangs around the fields collecting trinkets she finds during her errands. errands. Gerdy himself is very obviously a hermit's son, wearing the minimum amount of clothes with his hair untrimmed and instead bundled on his head with not even an inch of fabric to cover those
massive grippers he calls feet.
Until about an hour into the game. When you leave the village, you discover that not only do humans reside here, but anthropomorphic animals do as well. In this game's world, there are mole people, whatever the heck this guy is, talking trees, fox bakers, fox wizards, cowardly bees, self-absorbed elves, stingy leprechauns, even more mole people, bear children, hide-and-seek beavers, and some kind of asshole weasels that like to throw people in jail. Gerdy doesn't question the existence of even a single one of them, and instead tries to bargain and plead with them as he continues on his journey. No matter what you're doing in this game, the fantasy elements are dialed to 11 and somehow manage to accomplish being believable. There isn't some weird fourth wall breaking thing to compare it to in our real life. Oh wait, yeah there is. Despite the entirety of this world being so far removed from our own, there are two instances where the immersion kind of falls apart, and that's the inclusion of these two game show quiz challenges. This bucktooth creature with a pompadour asks you 3 questions you must get right to get behind the curtain. You could write this off as a reference of some kind, or a cameo from a voice actor or something, but in my research, I found there was nothing to link this character to the outside world. In the second encounter, you have to complete the level 100% before interacting with him to even gain access to the end of the level. The game tries really hard to make this guy's inclusion feel believable, but you really do question his existence every second you're forced to interact with him. You can mostly forget ever encountering this guy though, as he has little to no impact on the rest of the game that you've become immersed in. You'll come to find though that playing Herdy Gerdy, rather than just reading about its mechanics, is a totally different beast to deal with. Because while fundamentally the simplicity and entertainment you get out of the game is far greater than the sum of its parts, you will still end up contending with some pretty jank functionality that hurts the rest of the game rather than highlight it. For example, Herdy Gerdy suffers from some pretty undercooked creature AI, and there really isn't a particular group that's worse or better than the rest. Dupes will maintain their group fairly well and stick to the direction the player is facing, but if you end up in a corner or try to push them through a gap in a wall or a door, it's very easy for one or more of them to suddenly break away from the rest and shoot off in another direction, forcing you to either herd what's left and go back, or stop your group completely while you go chasing the one that wouldn't keep it together. Bleeps will follow you in a single file line while you play the flute, and for the most part they can keep it together as they follow you. But if you take a corner just a bit too sharply, or if you have them follow you over a ledge and don't keep that momentum going when you land, the line can break apart and sever the 2 or 3 at the end of your 8 bleep lineup. Gromps will get off their butts and chase you after they see you or the creatures you're herding, but if they break line of sight and fall back down again, they have to get themselves back up and make a wide turn in order to follow you again. This can cause them to clip through the level in certain places, or despite them being behind a wooden fence, they won't get up to go around it and follow you. Herdy Gerdy also suffers from a problem that a lot of 6th generation video games did in this time, and that's having a terrible free-flowing third-person camera. Using the right analog stick, the player can have the camera rotate around Gerdy, using him as the center point as the camera orbits him. By pressing down on the stick, the player can alternate between 3 different camera angles. One that's up close, one that's a ways back, and one that goes high into the air so you can see around Gerdy. This in and of itself isn't a bad setup. The multiple angles are helpful, especially when the level you're playing has varying altitudes and terrain to navigate. However, the camera in Herdy Gerdy functions a lot like the PS1 Spyro trilogy, in that it's anchored to the player character at all times and will move on its own. The only video setting in this game is the ability to change the screen position to better fit the TV you're using. There's no way to turn off this automatic functionality, which turns out to be a tremendous defect in an otherwise passable system. If the player is using the farthest viewing setting and the camera gets caught on a piece of the level, let's say a cliff ledge or a tree branch, the camera will automatically reset to the closest view in a seemingly random position so it isn't caught on anything anymore. This happens often, and I don't think there was a single level where it happened and I didn't get punished somehow, like falling in a river or getting attacked by a gromp. This would sometimes force a player to reset the level due to the screw up, or just make it take longer to finish everything. I wanted to talk about Herdy Gerdy today because I recently had a conversation in my friend group about how massive and complicated video games have become. We've entered an era where video games take more than a few years of development time, with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people working on them to make even a standard size video game. The ability that even a single person on a development roster has is far superior than one from the 1990s or 2000s. I think this is largely due to the fact that players want to be able to be invested in a believable experience, and that they are simply unable to move past things like pixelated grass textures and jagged hair particles anymore. Massive castles and mansions need to come close to the real thing, down to the way that a carpet is wrinkled on the floor, or the way that a flame flickers in a lantern. If they can't replicate these things well, that game is just considered bad and even unplayable. Yet it's entirely possible for a person to simply walk past all of that stuff, ignoring the intricate detail that was painstakingly put into making sure that design aspect functioned properly for their convenience. Perhaps it's due to the fact that video games have gotten that large in the first place being the issue here, what with publishers trying to come up with any reason to raise the industry standard price of a video game. Players want to feel like they're getting their money's worth out of a video game that's priced that high. That leaves it up to the developers to find a way to fill their game with stuff to do to justify asking that much money. But it's not like every design change is all that it's cracked up to be either. I'd argue it's easier to find the best examples of the fun in simplicity by way of shorter, smaller titles from the 6th generation of consoles. In the 2000s, games were maxed out at a 480p resolution and couldn't push harder than 30 frames per second. Unless you were a then massive studio like Kojima Productions or Bungie, your games had a difficult time standing out graphically. For every Metal Gear Solid and Halo game, you had 4 or 5 smaller titles with a funky art style to help keep them in the public eye. For me, Herdy Gerdy comes to mind immediately as one of those kinds of games. This game doesn't focus on providing you with the most realistic looking graphics capable of being pushed by the PS2. Instead, it focuses on a very unique style in its presentation, showing us characters with exaggerated proportions and highlighted features to tell you about their history. Anthropomorphic characters are matched with personality types that fit their actions and the word they say. The creature design of your herding animals is unique, despite there being so many different types with different needs and quirks during the herding process. The animation during the cutscenes and character introductions is surprisingly fluid, and despite taking place in this enormous mythic landscape where magic is abound and legends influence people's daily lives, the setting and lore never gets too big for its own good. Everything is somehow able to stay completely central to Gerdy and his journey to Tournament Island. There is centuries of storytelling established within even the first hour of playtime in this game, and in any other modern RPG or adventure game, that's something that could lead to immediate bloating and scope creep that transforms the plot of the game into something unrecognizable by the end. But this game just doesn't do that. Gerdy's adventure is completely reliant on his own abilities and feats. The game never moves beyond the fact that all the player has to worry about is leading these animals to their pens while avoiding setbacks in the process. The player cannot die in this game. There is no game over screen. If you fall in a river, Gerdy just struggles his way back to the shore. If you're caught by a gromp, you're just biffed somewhere else entirely. If you get thrown off of Scrag's nest, you just hit the ground with a thud before getting up and dusting yourself off. The game keeps your expectations to a surprising minimum and becomes more enjoyable as a result. Even with an acorn that has the magical ability of creation itself at stake in this tournament, Herdy Gerdy still focuses your attention on the journey rather than the destination. The game makes clear that the important thing is Gerdy's, and by extension the player's, growth as a herder. It will be your proficiency and your experiences that make this game enjoyable, not how enormous the stakes are and the thrills that would usually entail. Unfortunately, the artistic vision that carried Herdy Gerdy wasn't enough to make it a hit with the audience and critics. Across the board, the game received pretty middling review scores, including a 69 out of 100 from Metacritic,
Nice.
where critics cited the game as a fresh, unique, and light-hearted adventure, but at the same time came off as frustrating with unresponsive assets and controls. Herdy Gerdy only released on the PS2 in North America and Europe, and as a result sold less than a combined 120,000 copies. Before Core Design could attempt to redeem themselves with a potential sequel or a spin-off in this universe, they were forced to liquidate as a studio after the disaster that was Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness in 2003. Several of the founding staff left Eidos Interactive altogether to form their own studio, and what was left of Core was acquired by Rebellion Developments in May of 2006. Today, in the year 2024, it's difficult to find many people who remember playing this game during their adolescence. For me and my brother, it's always been a fond memory, as it's one of those games that was difficult for us to play as kids that we grew up to figure out was irritatingly difficult for no good reason. Herdy Gerdy, along with the other Core Design productions, were then placed on a shelf to gather dust and become the subject of internet video essays like this one. In retrospect though, I do find myself coming back to play this game once or twice a year for no other reason than to just give myself a break from the massive open world epics with huge maps and layers of mechanics. I will always want to play games like God of War, Elden Ring, and Final Fantasy, because those are the kind that interest me. I can fully appreciate the level of effort that has to go into creating those kinds of games. There's little reason to doubt why a game like this takes a few years to finish, and I find it incredible that people get paid for manufacturing such wonderful works of art. But I do often find myself hankering to return to the days of earlier gaming, where more often than not, most design aspects weren't so layered and deep. It might just be because I'm older now, and I can see the patterns more clearly, or because I've played them a bunch and know all of the little secrets and idiosyncrasies, but these games of running and jumping, collecting and herding, all give me a form of pleasure that I find is difficult to replicate nowadays. There's just something so entertaining about jumping through different points in time to whack a monkey over the head with a lightsaber and then capture it with a butterfly net. There's something so satisfying about making an incredibly difficult jump across a pit just to pick up a hidden 1-up at this early stage in the game. There's something so gratifying about plotting out paths for these creatures to run through as you bring them to their pens under a set amount of time. Maybe I'm just looking in the wrong places, but to me, I just love finding the fun and simplicity and the games that provide it to me. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate each and every single one of you. Don't forget to stay awesome, and be kind and rewind. Excelsior.